Evening, I'd like to call the workshop for January 23rd, 2023 to order. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues and council members present. Councilmember Sarah Beeson. Hey, Sarah. Councilmember Christine Hall. Oh, Sarah. Christine. Hi, Sarah. Christine.
Hi. Oh, we're going to...
Yeah.
Here's Christine.
Yeah. Councilmember Lee Hills. Councilmember William Morthland. Hello, Willie. Councilmember Michael Palermo. Applause, please. And then Councilmember Peter Vanstrom. He is suffering in great pain right now, so I don't know if Peter's going to make our work session. So we may miss him, and hopefully he'll be able to make us for the council meeting, but I know he's suffering right now. Also in attendance is City Administrator Mr. Randy Knighton, our City Attorney Mr. David Davidson, and our City Clerk Marlene Press. Hey, Marlene. So today's topic, and Randy may go into a little detail about a work session. So this is a work session, not a committee meeting, and obviously not a council meeting. Work sessions are run by the mayor, and today's topic is a discussion of municipal elections. And we need to stop. The press just came in. Stop the presses. Today's topic is a discussion of municipal elections. A lot of conversation has been had in the last 18 months, and more recently, particularly by our colleague, City of Milton, underneath the leadership of Mayor Peyton Jamison. They have been aggressively pursuing some options on holding municipal elections, and as recently as last week, myself, along with the other mayors of North Fulton, Mayor Jim Still of Mountain Park, Mayor Jim Gilvin of Alpharetta, Mayor John Bradbury of Johns Creek, and of course the aforementioned Peyton Jamison of Milton, along with the city administrators and their staffs. And we also had Councilmember Lee Hills and Chief of Staff Jamie Gazzetti join us for a meeting with Milton last week at Milton City Hall to talk in some detail about North Fulton City's holding municipal elections. So this workshop is to go into a deeper dive about the potential of holding municipal elections here in Roswell, along with our sister cities in North Fulton, Mountain Park, Johns Creek, Milton, and Alpharetta. Sandy Springs at this time does not have another municipal election to 2025, so they will not be participating potentially as Alpharetta, Milton, Johns Creek, Milton, Alpharetta, Johns Creek, help me out here. Mountain Park, and the city of Roswell. Thanks, guys. So, with that being said, and no further ado, I'd like to pass it over to our city administrator, Mr. Randy Knighton, who will begin the presentation.
Thank you, Mayor Wilson, and good evening to Mayor and Council and to all of the residents who are present with us this evening. As Mayor Wilson mentioned, this work session will attempt to address one topic, and that is municipal elections. As he has outlined, there have been some conversation about municipal elections and the prospect, potentially, the city and or cities conducting municipal elections apart from Fulton County. We'll hopefully address a couple of items here this evening, and certainly field questions from the mayor and council, and of course in work sessions. There's no public comment. This is a public meeting, but no public comment unless specifically authorized. And I will also mention again that we'll also have a committee meeting tomorrow evening. We will take an even deeper dive into this issue. And so this evening we certainly elicit questions by mayor and council, and there may be certain items that we will either further research or provide to you, certainly by committee meeting tomorrow, as well as we address this topic. And I'll also, of course, mention the vision statement to be the #1 community family in America here in the city of Roswell. Of course, elections are fundamental to our representative democracy, and therefore certain steps have to be taken to ensure federal, state laws are met, as well as city charters. The state code, chapter 2, 2 of Title 21 addresses municipal elections, and in 1998, state law was changed to incorporate municipal election code into the state election code, and a few distinctions remain, but basically municipal elections happen in odd numbered years. A couple of key dates here, or dates that we wanted to present just to give you some general timeline. Typically, qualifying fees are done by February 1st. Obviously, the city has already established those. Qualifying period, we see on a particular date, that's an estimated date. Request for absentee ballots, publish advance voting notices, publish notices for call of election, advance voting into October, November, then general election, and then the deadline for county, in this case Fulton County, certification of general election returns. Those are general dates that happen during the course of an election. Also, there are things that would need to be established should the city and or cities determine to conduct their own elections, and that is training for an election superintendent, where to store voting equipment, how to secure voting equipment, which is key, recruitment, and hiring of poll workers, training for those poll workers, securing polling locations, which would need to be strategically located, and obviously ADA compliant, certifying ballots, and potentially printing ballots as well. A couple of operational processes, of course, potentially on a particular voting day, voter check-in, casting votes, counting votes, advanced voting, election day, polling locations, and staffing. All of these are part of the operational processes of the voting apparatus, which would need to be taken into account and given considerable contemplation with respect to potential polling locations and staffing. These are all components of the voting process, which potentially an election superintendent would be responsible. Here is a memorandum received from Fulton County directly, which you have in your packet. Therefore, to not have the county incur costs in conducting municipal elections, Fulton County will be requesting approval to have the municipal cost resolution revised. They would like to revert to a percentage of election cost based on municipalities' number of registered voters. They have indicated that since 2017, their election costs have increased from about $2 per voter to about $9 per voter. Here's a table directly from the memorandum we received, and obviously you can see Roswell here, number of voters. In 2021, the city of Roswell paid just at $373,000. That's $373,000. And Fulton County, per this distribution proposal, would escalate to $677,000, just over $9 per voter. Obviously, that significant increase as proposed provides the city with some level of consideration of how that should be addressed and whether or not the city or cities would be better positioned or best positioned to conduct their own elections. You can see that number for not only the city of Roswell, but the escalation that would take place for all of these cities. A couple of administrative responsibilities as it relates to elections. Generally speaking, when elections are held, if a municipality holds an election, there's an election superintendent. In some cases, the city clerk may be the one who holds that position. Obviously, we've been utilizing Fulton County for a number of years. And many of those responsibilities of it, election superintendent would include overseeing the entire election process and ensuring that all state laws and municipal ordinances are followed and enforced, and ensuring that notification takes place for those who may be running for election. In addition, there is an extensive and robust training process that is ensured for election superintendents. And obviously there is great conversation and discussion in connection with the Secretary of State's office, overseeing special elections, should those take place as well, and making sure the city's elections stay consistent with the Georgia Election Code, and obviously to provide timely communications to the public. A couple of other additional items for consideration. Can economies of scale be realized if cities pool together and conduct their elections rather than in isolation, but conduct their elections collectively? For instance, the North Fulton cities, Johns Creek, Alpharetta, which I believe is considering this tonight, and also Milton and Mountain Park and Alpharetta as well. Administrative staff would potentially be consolidated. There would likely be some cost savings there, as we realize that being able to pool resources and intellectual capital would probably serve citizens well. Voter registration would still be held with Fulton County under a potential arrangement per their responsibilities as a county government. Additional items that would obviously need to be considered, as mentioned before, would be polling locations, and if the city were to take over elections in some fashion. Many of our community centers would likely be ideal locations. Of course, what comes with that is ensuring there's a secure location for voting equipment. Also, any potential disruption to normal recreational activities would have to be taken into account for the period of advanced voting and or election day. Those considerations would obviously be factored into how the city would consider having its own municipal elections. There are a number of steps that would need to be taken, obviously, to comply with state and federal law. The timeline that I identified earlier gives just basically a general snapshot of what that could look like leading into a November election. But there is, if the city, mayor and council would like to consider this, there is a sense of urgency with respect to the decision-making process given where we are in this current year. And so with that, we'll entertain any questions, any thoughts from mayor and council.
Thanks, Mr. Knighton, for the presentation, and I don't know, I had a chance to review their packet. I know Councilmember Hills would probably like to open the discussion based upon the meeting last week with the city of Milton, Johns Creek, Alpharetta, and Mountain Park.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Knighton. Thank you, Mayor Wilson. It was 2 weeks ago, just for record.
Wow.
I know time flies when you have to make a decision. It was an enlightening meeting. The mayors were very engaged, concerned about costs of the taxpayers, the what-ifs, the fallback plan, and overwhelmingly, they were all interested. I can't speak for each individual city, but very interested in participating in this. Of course, Milton has moved forward. They're absolutely holding their own elections, their municipal elections. So, I mean, I think we have a lot of opportunities here to serve our taxpayers, our residents, and remove ourselves from Fulton County and some of the things that surround that mechanism.
Thanks, Lee. Christine.
So, should this come to pass, do we select the equipment and the apparatus, or is that an apparatus that we are provided or have to use from the county or from the state? And would all the cities have to be on the same mechanism?
So Randy, I'll initially answer it, and then I'd like you to kind of double back and buttress or correct anything that so part of if the cities decide to go together and do this, the very first thing is you have to appoint an election superintendent, which is a big deal. That is no small job. The second part of that is there has to be, and we talked about this so when Milton did their due diligence on this, the committee at the end of the day recommended paper ballots. So in our conversation 2 weeks ago, thanks Lee for correcting me, we discussed, from my perspective, and Milton had put this on the table, and I think the other mayors were kind of the same alignment, once we talked about it, was it's not a gigantic investment to add scanners to it, much like you have in the Fulton County process. The scanner is a one-time investment. And, but my understanding, and Randy, you tell me if I'm incorrect on this, my understanding is that we ostensibly have to agree to do it the same way if we're going to have an election superintendent, because the election superintendent's got to have the same standards to monitor. So what was interesting was that the cost outlays weren't not nearly as significant as I imagined they were going to be going into this. There is a reoccurring fee for some software with respect to the scanners, but yes, one, you got to have an election superintendent that would govern all of the cities in North Fulton, Alpharetta, Johns Creek, Milton, Mountain Park, and Roswell, and would be responsible for all 5 of those cities. And 2, that they would be using the same type of equipment so that the monitoring process could be consistent. Yeah, Randy, you want to add anything
No,
to that?
Mayor,
Sir?
I think that is absolutely correct.
Mr. Blairwell.
Thank you. So this has definitely been doing a lot of research on this very recently. This is not a topic I'm as familiar with, but and so disappointed that there's a need for such a focus on this. But unfortunately, with Fulton County's cost they've provided, I think we have no choice but to be seriously considering this. Couple things I just want to point out, because I found it interesting in researching this, having a watch of the video of one of the Fulton County boards of electorate. I forget the exact one. I was pretty surprised to see with my own hear with my own ears just them. It sounded to me like they were legitimately suggesting that cities look at this themselves. That was my interpretation of listening to that recording. I had a resident who I respect very much and trust very much, but when they told me that, I still felt I had to hear it with my own ears, and sure enough, I did, and that's definitely what it sounded like to me when I'd listened to that. But a couple of things I want to mention as well. One, that if we are to consider going this direction, I think it is absolutely crucial that we are partnering with other cities and creating that scale, creating that consistency and that uniformity. And so I think that is something that's really important. And then just a question, Mr. Knight, and you might not know the answer, but if we could go back to the page or the slide that had all the different cities, their percentage, and therefore their cost. So how many of these cities have a polling place for early voting inside their municipality? Is that half of them? Is that 3/4? Is that all of them? Do we have any idea? And that's not a relevant question for the decision the city makes. It's more of just I'm so disappointed by the very large cost increase and just seeing how large that is, and I'm just wondering if what they've been providing, I'm just kind of curious, when you're paying that much more, is it that you're getting more additional type support, or is it just no, it's all the same support, just if you have more voters, then you're gonna have a much higher cost?
Is that a rhetorical question, Mike?
And it's what I'm sincerely curious about. So I don't know if you know the answer. Do we know how many of these, for example, have an early voting polling location?
Each particular city, if I answered that question, it would be hazardous. I can tell you that early voting obviously is important, and I can tell you that one of the pieces we've talked about is that every city would have, for example, Roswell would have at least 2 early voting locations, at least, for at least 3 weeks, as like the current system goes. I will tell you, Michael, when you get into this, there's so many things to unpack, and one of the things that I want to be very deliberate about doing is to not oversell this, but to undersell this, because I think that the ramifications of this have such a potential positive for the residents of Roswell and our sister cities, Milton, Johns Creek, Alpharetta, and Mountain Park. There are so many pieces to this equation that I think the cost is hard to honestly justify. And to your point, and I don't want to speak for Nadine Williams, who's a very fine person, but our sense was the same as you just mentioned, is that it seems like they would like to get out of the municipal election business and would like for us to get into it. And quite frankly, I personally welcome that opportunity. I think that's a great thing for the residents of Roswell. I think if it were put to a plebiscite, right, based upon just those simple facts, would you like to hold your own elections? I think that the numbers would be staggeringly high among Roswell residents. And that's not even getting into real things that I think down the road we'll begin to uncover, for example, voter rolls. As you saw there, it's showing 72,264 eligible voters out of a population of approximately 96, 97, 98,000 people. There is good reason to believe that those voter rolls, if Roswell were to take them underneath a municipal election, would be cleaned up. Now, that's a very complicated process, and that's a very easy thing for me to say, because there's a lot there to do, and there's a lot of parties involved in that. But there is reason to believe that the voter rolls do need to be cleaned up. And I think that if voters understood some of the, I want to use the right terminology, the incorrectness of some of the voter rolls, I think a lot of Roswell voters would be very surprised, disappointed, and would want us to do something about it immediately.
Thank you. And great points, Mayor, and I appreciate that. And something you mentioned gets back to kind of my sincere curiosity for the question, which is because I strongly believe, as we've had in the past, that Roswell is a very large city with a lot of voters and absolutely deserves and needs a voting location for early voting on the east side and the west side of Roswell.
Absolutely.
And so to see that Fulton County is proposing these large increased costs and a reduction of service is surprising to me. And that's where I'm wondering, knowing what a large population Roswell represents, knowing that there's so many with a fraction, if they're having a single early voting location when Roswell has such an exponentially larger number compared to so many of these cities, it's just, again, really disappointing to see how Fulton County has done things and proposed things from a cost standpoint.
Just as an aside, and it's anecdotal, and I think everybody in this room experienced it, was just in our most recent election that Sarah participated in, you saw that the early voting lines in all of our cities, Alpharetta, Johns Creek, Alpharetta most notably, and Roswell most notably, had extremely long lines in early voting. It really was a lack of capacity. And interestingly enough, the day of election numbers, right, did not shore up historically like they have in the past. But to your point, if you've got a capacity issue, you have to address the capacity issue, because the whole point about it is truly franchising everybody who has the opportunity to vote, who wants to vote, needs to vote. And it's our job to make sure that people can do that.
Thank you. And so, lastly, obviously, from just the fact that Fulton's proposing increased costs for decreased service makes me feel we absolutely have to discuss this and consider this. And then what I would just bring up, I already brought up one point, that if the city does decide to go in this direction, I think it's really important to being consistent and creating scalability with it, hopefully as many neighboring cities as possible. That's one thing that I would ask this council to consider. The other one is, I guess, really just my concern is the fact that we're basically the end of January now, and we're talking about a November election, which involves early voting and so many other details of the process, which Mr. Knighton presented earlier. Just really hoping that everyone involved is really just thinking very much about those details and how confident staff is and others that truly could be achieved within this short of a runway.
We had two questions. Those are incredibly germane and relevant questions. They are the most urgent questions. Right? Can you pull this off successfully? And what is your plan B and plan C, right, based upon all the variables? The good news is that Milton has done a significant amount of due diligence. The good news is that the supply chain for the pieces needed to put the equipment pieces, the logistical pieces into place, at this time, Michael, are in play. So that doesn't look like there's logistical issues from a standpoint of acquiring equipment or acquiring ballots that make it like, oh, you're going to have a hiccup there. Now, we all know in life there's always hiccups. The most important part of this process, from my perspective, Lee, and you jump in on this, is that getting an election superintendent who's highly qualified. This is, although it is appointed by the various cities, it is not a political appointing, because this is a process that the law is very clear about. It has a very separate, clear unencumbered process from elected officials. And it's very important to have a highly competent, highly objective election official to manage your elections. And I think that was one of the things that the cities are very clear on. I will say that, it's kind of like, for the last year, we have been working, and this is kind of another manifestation of it, and I know it's a bit unrelated, but I think it's related, Mike, is that, we said, hey, we really want to have strong working relationships and cooperation with our sister cities. This is a big step, and the fact that this is a big step in that process, and the fact that we're having the kind of discussions that we're having, like, we recognize this is all in the best interest of one another's residents, and this is very important to North Fulton County. We hope, obviously, that the South Fulton counties might see the same thing. As you know, we just got through the loss negotiations with all 15 cities and had this incredible cooperative spirit with all 15 cities. So my hope is that our southern brothers and sisters will see the same light. But at this time, it is urgent. And yeah, it would have been great, if we had this conversation last January 23rd, rather than January 23rd this year. But sometimes it is important to seize the day, because I think at the end of the day, if we don't seize the day, we'll be asked by our residents, why did you continue with Fulton County? Why did you at least double the cost of our election? And it doesn't look, and Fulton County really potentially maybe didn't want to hold the elections. So I think there's a lot of questions there where we say, yes, your questions are so germane and so on spot. Like, this is, we have to move. If we are going to do this, we have to make a decision pretty quickly as a deliberative body. Sarah, by the way, unfortunately, Sarah, I have to tell you, the mayor runs this meeting, so this is a bad meeting for everybody here. I know.
It's always a great meeting with you, Mayor. Couple questions. We talked a little bit about precincts. So do we have any dollar amounts, and it could be based on the technology that we choose to use to administer the elections, of if we're able to provide the same number of polling locations? I think right now, correct me if I'm wrong, Marley might actually know this one. Is it 23 polling locations in Roswell?
21, some of them are like.
Combined.
They're combined, right?
Combined.
So 21 polling locations in the city of Roswell. Would we be able to provide that same number and have a comparable, if not more competitive price compared to Fulton County? And if so, what would the staffing look like for those precincts as well?
So, Randy, I'll let you again buttress and answer much better than I will. The first answer is, in my opinion, Sarah, that's a decision that you and your colleagues are going to make on how many voting precincts you think are the right number. Because I think that there's a good question about, do we have too many voting precincts? I have heard that comment more than once. I'm not saying that's correct, but I have heard that. So I think that's a question that you guys will have to make a decision on, is what is the right number of polling precincts. I think one thing that I can speak for, that clearly there will be early voting on both the east side and the west side, unencumbered, no ifs, ands, or buts about that. I feel very clear that you guys will decide on that. In terms of polling precincts, though, I think you'll make that decision. There is a large, just like Fulton County, and this is one of the things I think where we feel optimistic about. One of the challenges we've had, Sarah, in my estimation, is we've had incredible outpouring of volunteers wanting to man elections, wanting to be there, wanting to be a part of it. It's been difficult. And you saw last year at Roswell, Roswell had the largest majority of volunteers by a significant number, even versus our sister cities. So I think there's incredible appetite for people wanting to be trained, wanting to volunteer, and wanting to work, which is the overwhelming majority of people that work the polling locations. So the answer is, part of that is volunteers, which I don't want to sound too optimistic, but I feel very confident that the city of Roswell will have, particularly if they find out we're running the elections, I think you'll get more volunteers than you know what to do with. What was your last question?
Quasi-related to that, so in terms of the staffing and the volunteers, looking at the timeline that Mr. Knighton provided, it's almost around now that they would start gearing up to begin training for polling workers. Obviously, we don't even have a head of elections yet. So given if we are trying to target 2023, do we have an idea what that consolidated schedule would look like, based off when we would start hiring, training, et cetera?
we have some preliminary schedules, but Randy, you want to address that at all?
Sure, yes. And obviously, as Mayor mentioned, there is some urgency around this issue. And if this mayor and council and the other cities would like to partner via intergovernmental agreement, obviously, that process would start virtually immediately to begin seeking to hire an election superintendent who then would be responsible for ensuring that all dates and requirements are met, including training and the obtaining poll workers, as well as developing the framework by which the election would take place. I do want to mention one other thing to the mayor's point. Fulton County is proposing in their 2023 election to only have one early voting location in Roswell, only one. That's their proposal. And so obviously I think that registers some concern as well. And to Councilmember Palermo's earlier question, they are not proposing early voting locations in all of the cities. In fact, East Point, Hapeville, and College Park, they would only have one voting location, one in Roswell and Mountain Park, one in Alpharetta, one in Johns Creek, and I believe one in Chattahoochee Hills and one in South Fulton or some other combination thereof, but they're not proposing early voting locations in all of those cities. Yes, and
Make a
Yes,
follow-up.
please.
So in tomorrow night's committee meeting, Sarah, there will be examples of what's the cost if 10,000 voters vote, 12,500 voters, 15,000, 17,500, or 20, normal models. One thing that's interesting, if you look at the number of the $677,807.86, or $9.38 per voter. I don't want to speak out of turn, and I don't want to speak unfairly. We don't have confidence today that that's the final number. And you watched the, Michael, you watched the deliberation last week. There is a sense among us that if we decide to move forward with elections, we decide in Fulton County to do the election as prescribed, as normal, that we may get popped more. One other thing that I'd point out to you is Randy mentioned the election in 2021
that is correct, yes.
was $374,000. That included the runoff. So it wasn't just the election, it also included the runoff. That is for the one early voting piece and the election to be held on November the 7th. Thank you. Yeah, so just FYI, that's kind of interesting. So as I said, I do not want to oversell this in terms of dollars, but I do believe that it is a significant amount of money if we're just talking about money, which I think we're also talking about other pieces. To answer your question, Sarah, there will be some people paid, obviously. Do we have an outline? Is that tomorrow night in the committee meeting where you're going to put the outline of the people
Yes.
that get paid through the process?
Yes, we'll go into some level of detail about poll worker salary, election superintendent salary, the costs associated with the secure ballot boxes, additional storage, postage, advertising, all of those different things we can itemize and provide some general numbers to you.
The training cost.
Training costs.
Who does the training?
Referring back to the early voting locations, so with the assumption that, say, we did a North Fulton consolidated version of this, because I think that's kind of how Fulton County was operating previously. I know a number of Roswell voters don't vote early in Roswell. They vote early in Johns Creek, they vote early at the Alfred Library, they vote early at Milton Library. Would that still be on the table? That said, begs the question, are we also able to use Fulton County locations for our voting locations? So for example, the libraries, any of the county properties that we were previously using, are those going to be on the table? So twofold question of if we're able to use the early voting locations outside our city and if we're able to use county.
Sure, I'll address that if I can. Yes, I believe if there was an intergovernmental agreement reached between the North Fulton cities, that there would be a consolidation and understanding of voting at those different locations. I think that would be permissible, it's my understanding. And then your second question was related to, I'm sorry.
The second question was if we're able to use Fulton County's.
Use Fulton County's
Properties.
libraries or any of their county-owned properties.
Correct.
We would have to seek their approval and receive, or develop some type of intergovernmental agreement for utilization of those facilities. I'm not sure what cost that may be realized from utilizing those facilities, but we would have to seek approval from Fulton County to use those facilities.
So in that case, say for instance, Fulton County denies us, I know many of them are schools, many of our voting locations are schools and libraries. Do we have enough potential properties that we could seek out as alternatives?
I would say yes.
Okay.
And I think that as a result of, again, the very robust Parks and Recreation Department that we have a number of those locations. And also there are, of course, other venues that could be considered as well. And given our geography, obviously we want to strategically locate those polling locations to provide best access for all of the residents. Yes.
Willie?
The way I'm looking at this is Fulton County has basically priced themselves out of this business and they're begging us to go away. In terms of Fulton County properties, if they're asking us to go, I would rather us go to our Parks and Recreation buildings. I would rather go to the local churches, synagogues, temples, mosques, provide them the income of the rental of their property, keep the money within the Roswell circle here. But that's neither here nor there. Now, I was here during the poll worker volunteer sessions, and this room was full. It was absolutely full of people. There's not going to be any downside to us recruiting Roswell residents to take on this. That I think they would welcome it with open arms, no question about it. The leader that day, and I don't know her official title, but the leader that day actually told me as the session was ending that she was amazed at the amount of interest from Roswell residents in voting, and that this was the highest turnout across the board that she had seen, nowhere even close. So fantastic job by the Roswell residents in seeing that through. My only real question is if we are going to be held to the Fulton County standard, and that standard is the machines that they are providing, are we to rent from Fulton County? Are we to lease from Fulton County? Or are we just on our own having to use the same equipment, same software?
Well, you're really held, Willie, to federal standards, state standards. That's really kind of the overriding piece when you talk about elections. Those are really what you're complying with. You don't have to use the Fulton County equipment. As a matter of fact, the Milton model is, their recommendation internally was hand ballots. And in our discussion with us, when we had that meeting 2 weeks ago, they had looked at scanners, and I said, for my money, or for the residents of Roswell money, I should say much better, it would make a lot more sense to go ahead and put that scanner piece in as a hard data backup. Makes a lot more sense. It's not that much money, and it's a huge, to me, backup of security. So it would be our equipment. It would be Milton would own their equipment. Johns Creek would own their equipment. Alpharetta would own their equipment. And so it wouldn't be Fulton County equipment. We wouldn't be leasing it. You know that. That's part of the initial, there's initial startup cost. So one part of this we really have discussed is we have a little higher entry cost here, which is interesting. So the cost, and again, I don't want to oversell it, but the cost actually should get better for the 5 cities as time goes on. Councilmember Palermo.
Thank you, Mayor Wilson. I want to point out that I do think there's a lot of benefits to having the place that a Roswell voter would vote in a municipal election being the same place they would vote in a statewide election. And so I think if possible, it's really beneficial for it to be those same places, because I'd tell you, I think a lot of Roswell residents, none that would be coming in this room, but there's a lot of Roswell residents that I believe wouldn't know if the state, county, or city was fully deciding a lot of those details. They just know that when there's an election, if they're gonna vote early, they go to the library. If they're gonna vote on election day, they go to the school near their house. And that's just how I think a lot of residents would be thinking about it. So I certainly don't like the idea of it having to be different for municipal. That being said, as Mr. Knighton made me realize, Fulton County could always decide they want to charge some large amount for it, which obviously, if they're going to make it cost prohibitive, then it's not an option. But it's really disappointing to me because whether it's a Fulton County location or frankly even a Fulton County voting machine, it seems to me like Fulton County feels it belongs to Fulton County. I believe strongly that it belongs to the residents of Fulton County, which very much are the residents of all the cities up here. So it's really disappointing to see that not only are they going to charge so much for the service, and as pointed out earlier, decreased service, but they're also going to charge potentially so much for residents of these cities to use the buildings that really belong to them.
Mike, can I make a comment on your comment? I think your point is really good about the consistency of where the elections take place. I would offer up a thought, though. And I would defer to yourself, Sarah, and Christine, who are the real numbers people on local elections. You guys know, you three know the numbers. But if you look historically, right, we struggle with 10 to 16, 17,000 people. I think the election in 2021, we had 17,000, right at 17. And that was a gigantic number for a municipal election. 17,000 at that time of 69,000 registered voters. That's what showed up for a municipal election. And that was big for the city of Roswell, and respectively big in relation to our sister cities, interestingly enough.
Actually, much, much bigger if you look at either an actual number or percentage number than the majority of our sister cities.
Exactly. But what's interesting about that, right? So you have a very active municipal election group of residents here in the city of Roswell. But the numbers pale in comparison to when you have a national state election. Your election of 2020, forget the number, I think it was above 70% of people that turned out here in the city of Roswell, of 69,000 registered voters, if I remember correctly. I don't know what the number was in your election, Sarah. It was pretty high, it dwarfed the number of a normal municipal election. So municipal elections certainly have much different turnouts, dramatically different. And even in Roswell, like you said, we have bigger turnouts in our sister cities. It's still pale in comparison to a national and state election. Yes, ma'am.
I think Councilmember Palermo makes an excellent point. I think when people vote, it should be a habit, and I think that also contributes to our sense of democracy and knowing that we're not having to re-educate a voter every other year, or even every cycle, as to where they need to go to vote. A question of mine that kind of was brought up by discussing the Milton model, which seems to be the method that we're entertaining. Milton's like a third of our size, and if they're going to do hand paper ballots, I mean, more power to them. We are much, much larger than they are. How do we foresee doing hand-marked paper ballots, even if we're scanning them we'll use y'all's last election as an example with 17,000 people, making sure that it's secure and doing it in a way that's well documented. Secondarily, and this is probably a question for City Attorney David Davidson, my understanding watching one of the 5 live streams that I watched from Fulton County was part of the reason a lot of this is going up is they're trying to meet the requirements from SB 202 and making sure that the elections are secured. How much of those requirements or that standard are municipalities held to that could possibly increase those costs or affect the methodology of how we would approach an election?
So I think we would be held to the same standard as far as the cost of the securing. We'll have to work on those numbers. I can't tell you that.
Sarah, do you have some special concern over SB 202?
So SB 202, I'm sure many in this room would know, was the state bill that was in order to secure our elections. It created a higher burden and a higher standard for whether it's a municipality or it's a county or it's a consolidated government, how they execute their elections. And I believe that it was Fulton County had made that point during one of their meetings. It might have been the October meeting of last year, where they had said part of it was they had to meet some of those standards, and that's where some of the higher incurred costs are. Whether or not it's 3 times the amount is a justified number, I don't know. I think that was just one of the reasons for providing it, but that to me begs the question of how we can make sure, and I mean, I think that's everyone in this room's goal, is to make sure we're having a accessible and fair election, but also a very constitutional election, one that people are very reassured that their vote is counted. And I want to make sure that we can meet, if not exceed, that burden of proof. But I think doing that in a financially feasible way is probably going to ultimately be the goal as well. And it might be a question for tomorrow because we don't really have any hard numbers for that yet. And that said as well, I am concerned about doing the hand paper ballots. While I realize that it would work for a city or town, Milton-sized, it does concern me with the number of voters that we have here in Roswell.
Randy?
Sure, I think, and I appreciate the question, and certainly we'll have as best answer we can for you by tomorrow evening, but some of the things that we've already begun to take a look at are a number of things that would have to be a part of an election. I mean, for instance, a secure bag for provisional ballots, a secure bag for challenge ballots, poll manager's bag, large bag for securing election supplies, locked storage box for absentee ballots. All of those things are itemized and will be costed out. But to your question, we'll certainly take a look at that and make sure that we're trying to account for it as a part of this overall cost estimate.
Yeah, I think it's really, and I think your question is well addressing that this is a serious endeavor to be taken seriously. Yes, sir, Councilmember Palermo.
Thank you. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention years ago when Fulton County tried to greatly increase the price to still a much smaller number than this. We were able to push back and get them a little lower and approximately the same time. They had tried to reduce it down to 1 early voting. We pushed back, got to 2. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, but at the same time, listening with my own ears to the Fulton County meeting doesn't give me a whole lot of optimism. And along those lines, I'm pessimistic that the reason for these cost increases is purely because of SB 202, because we all witnessed this year Fulton County looking to really increase the Fulton County tax burden through the cities and through really the city residents through loss, which we're very fortunate for Mayor Wilson and the other mayors of Fulton County getting together and coming to a great agreement that I really feel helped local taxpayers. I'm just concerned that I see this just as another opportunity for increasing really the burden on Roswell taxpayers and all city taxpayers. So I'd prefer if we didn't have to be having this discussion. I'd prefer if we were getting just the opportunity for a reasonable cost proposal. But just given everything that we're seeing, I'm just really disappointed about Fulton County's proposal.
Christine, do you mind if I make a comment? I hate to let the jig out, the secret on our incredibly capable city administrator, Mr. Randy Knighton. But Mr. Knighton unfortunately does not live in Roswell. Wish he did. Randy lives in Gwinnett County. And I bring that up because it's applicable to this discussion. It's a county. Randy, you want to elaborate a little bit on Gwinnett County and how they handle their elections, interestingly enough?
Sure, Gwinnett County is approximately right at 1 million people in the entire county, but all of their municipalities, they run their own elections. Peachtree Corners is one that actually Milton had some conversations with, I know extensively, but all of the cities there essentially run their own elections. I think it's 15 now cities in Gwinnett County who all run their own elections.
I bring that up, Randy, because as you remember during the discussion, one of my concerns was, having to, this is a serious task, and you want to make sure you do it right. You want to make sure you don't screw it up, and you want to make sure you take care of every ballot. And one of the things that for example, it's not big in terms of our numbers, but overseas ballots, right? And we were talking about that with the folks, and they said, like, the key is a good election superintendent. And this is, it's a serious task, but perhaps it's not as overbearingly tough and difficult as you might take it. And the example was brought up about the numerous cities that already undertake their own elections. And in this case, they actually undertake not only the municipal elections, but I believe the state and federal elections. But we're just talking about, for these North Fulton cities, municipal elections here in Roswell, Milton, Johns Creek, Alpharetta, and Mountain Park. But the point being is there are already a lot of cities who very capably are handling this and successfully handling this, and that we have this, we have the wherewithal to do it. I'm sorry, Christine, I cut you off.
No, I was just going to add, from a resident and from a prudent management of finances and managing costs, I have much more confidence in the City of Roswell leadership managing the costs than I put in Fulton County. And that is evidenced, if anybody feels like reading their annual reports, to see the problematic issues they have with their finances. So just on, this is not a light endeavor, of course. We want to do it right, we want to manage it correctly, but I have far more confidence in handling this at the local city level than putting the faith in the county.
Yes, ma'am, Lee.
I want to just circle back with an opinion on a couple of things. Regarding the number of precincts for early voting, I agree to keep two, one in the east and west. I know we're not deciding that tonight, but, and I say east and the west, it's all one Roswell, but I believe that we need to do that. I also agree with, but also have a side comment with Palermo and Beeson. I do like the consistency idea for the early voting, for election day voting, but I think it's absurd to think that that's something we would replicate going forward. I have no intention of disenfranchising anybody in this election when we run this, but I went and took pictures of the poll sites myself the last two elections, so two runoffs, and when I'm taking a photo of a site, I had 4 or 5, I can't remember, precincts within 3 miles of one another, and they had less than 100 people vote there. That is a huge misuse of money and resources, and I mean, just everything. So I think if we were doing a good job, which I believe we can, that we educate people this go around. I'm with you. I don't want to disrupt the apple cart. I want to make it as easy as possible. I'd like everybody in Roswell to vote. That would be my dream. I mean, I'm wearing my flag. I want to exercise my right and my responsibility, and I expect everybody that lives around me to do the same. But that's not how it goes. But I'd like to educate people as they're coming in. We're ramping up our community relations and publicity in the city as we speak. We've been working on it a year. I'd like to see the city electronically papered and maybe something else on educating folks where to go, and that they, by the way, in 2 years, they won't remember, but at least they've been told in 2 years, we're going to consolidate down and we'll have fewer sites, and we can execute that well. I think another reason to go forward with this year, I met with our city attorney, David Davidson, 2 years ago. Well, no, it was a year ago, about a year ago, following the year before, having looked into running municipal elections here with our previous mayor. And she was thrilled about it. She was a big proponent of it and got me in the loop on several things. And it takes about 9 months. And that's if you go it alone. We're working with several other cities who are as committed to this as we are, as well as one that's been doing the homework. I won't say I've been alongside, but I've been eavesdropping in these conversations for over 2 years, and sat at the table with many of the folks that have pulled this off in Milton. So I feel like we have a lot of resources to share in our, what did you do with this? How did that work? Have you run into this issue? And of course, with an election superintendent, we'd have that central core to help educate all of our sister cities at one time. So I'm a big proponent of this. I do think as we go, we'll find other areas where we can reduce costs. I don't know if it's going to be millions, but I think we can reduce costs as we go, as we learn. And I think that was all I had to say. Thank you.
Sarah, yes, ma'am.
Going back to Gwinnett County and how the municipalities administer their own elections, the largest city in Gwinnett County is Peachtree Corners at 42,000 people, which is still half of our size. So it's still not really an apples to apples comparison of what we'd be opening the door to. I also have an example of what happened in Gwinnett County. In 2018, in spring, they had a bond referendum a ballot referendum at the county level to determine whether or not they wanted to extend MARTA into Gwinnett County. Simultaneously, City of Snellville was operating a special election for city council. You could only vote for city council at City Hall for Snellville. You could only vote for the bond at a Gwinnett County voting location. Well, a lot of people knew about MARTA because there was a lot of money that went into that referendum. no one knew about the city of Snellville, and they assumed, oh, well, I already voted, or it's illegal to vote twice. The ballot drop-off between the city council race and the county level was massive. I want to say it was something to the tune of like 15% of people who voted in both elections. So that to me begs the question as, it's not rare, I say that as a product of one of those elections, that we have an off year where you have a municipal election, or even with the bonds, that would go theoretically on a county ballot. Is that still something we'd be entertaining, or is that still something that we want to solely manage our own elections?
So Sarah, can you give me a clear question on the latter part? Because you said a lot of things and I want to make sure I don't go.
So
go the wrong
in
way.
a year, typically on odd numbered years is when
Yes.
we do our municipals.
And that's, as you know, engendered by the state,
Correct. However, there are years where that is an exception.
special elections.
Correct. The bonds and my election being one of them. Would Fulton County absorb that election still onto their ballot the same way they did last year? Or we'd still pursue, in Gwinnett County's case, of administering our own election at the municipal level?
Sarah, I think that's an excellent question, and I'm not prepared, along with my colleagues, I think, to give you an answer on that question. I think that's an excellent question. Councilmember Mike.
Thank you. I have a comment and then a question. So the comment is, I would expect, because I believe it was state law that changed it, where basically it was my understanding, Mr. Davidson or Mr. Knighton, wasn't it the case where there was a state law in the last few years, last handful of years, where basically a city could get on a county ballot or get on a state ballot and not have to pay those costs? Was that something that was a law that was rolled out? Because it happened during my tenure, where I thought a rule had changed to save some costs for cities.
I know that it was part of our service delivery, and I know that Fulton County passed a resolution saying that.
Okay, so maybe it's a Fulton County thing,
Not
okay.
of the state law that was passed.
Okay, so I was probably thinking of Fulton County thing. So that's, that was one kind of just question that I had related to Councilmember Beeson's question.
Mike, can we just add a little piece since you're going down that line? Just to make everybody aware, and I wouldn't expect anybody to be aware of this, but I can tell you Mr. Knighton's aware of this. Last year, we went through Lost, which you do every 10 years. The next piece of great big fun we get to do this year in Fulton County and the 15 cities is, that's right. So I can't tell you that these two are, there's definitely an interchangeable aspect to this. And I really don't want it to be part of the conversation because it really needs to be a separate conversation. Do you want to do municipal elections in Roswell, and do you want to do that with your sister cities, right? That's really the equation. But I have a responsibility to let you know that we will be negotiating service delivery in 2023 with Fulton County. And I don't think, I will tell you tactically, it's the worst thing that ever happened if the cities are doing their own municipal elections from a service delivery negotiation perspective. I don't know what your thoughts on that, David or Randy? But that's not a reason to make the decision. Yes, sir.
And sorry, and a second question, and I'd say there's no question in my mind with negotiating with Fulton County that would certainly be something helpful in the negotiation. So that is crystal clear to me. My question was, I remember years ago, we had looked at, or just understanding the costs of, say, Cobb County. And at that time, it was far cheaper for what Cobb County was charging equivalent areas as to Roswell, except there was a state law that didn't allow us to use Cobb County, et cetera. I guess my question, which for staff, which I'm guessing probably don't know the answer this evening, but I'd be curious for other counties that do manage it as a county, so not like Gwinnett where they do it for cities, but for other counties, do they charge a similar amount that's being proposed here, or do they still charge significantly cheaper, which was certainly the case in some previous years? We were complaining about Fulton County's high costs.
I don't know right offhand. Certainly that's something we can research and bring back to you tomorrow. But I don't know right offhand what those numbers would be, so I don't want to speculate, but I have a sense of what they might be.
It'd be helpful if you are able to know for tomorrow. That'd be great for the discussion.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Willie?
So let's talk about next steps. We go tomorrow into council. We talk about the committee.
Committee, yes, sir.
Committee tomorrow. We
By the
talk
way,
about-
Randy will be running that meeting, so
Randy's running the committee meeting tomorrow. We talk about some numbers. We get comfortable with those numbers to where we're pushing this forward to the next council meeting, correct?
that's correct.
And then after that council meeting, if it is approved, is the first item of business to advertise for an election chair?
It's to sign an IGA with the other cities.
Okay.
Would be the very first thing, if the council approves it, the very first order of business would be to sign an IGA, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Randy, David? So we'd have to come to an agreement with our sister cities, which we've already discussed, obviously, and nobody, obviously, putting the cart before the horse. But to answer your prescription, committee tomorrow, if it comes out of committee and goes to council, it would go to council. We'd have a special council meeting next Monday. Next Monday is our,
Open forum on January 30th.
thank you, our public forum, which is a separate meeting, so we'd have to have, I believe, a special meeting to consider that if it comes out of committee tomorrow. And then from there, the next practical piece would be to sign the IGA, and then the next piece would be hire an election superintendent. That literally, those two, the IGA's got to come, and then the hiring the election superintendent. The election superintendent, I cannot, from my exposure, and I really, that's why I said, it's interesting, you probably noticed, we're very careful not to be critical of Fulton County in this process because Fulton County has certainly had its fair share of criticism in the last couple of years about the election process. And I want to be very clear that I don't want to make that part of this discussion, right? I want this to be about, is it feasible, is it rational, is it the right thing to do for the city of Roswell in coordination with our sister cities to hold municipal elections? And I really want to keep that kind of the cornerstone of the discussion. And I lost my thought, Willie. I'm looking at your good-looking face, and I just can't hold two thoughts at one time, man. I'm sorry.
Wife has the same
Oh,
problem.
sorry. Your wife does have the same time. So the IGA is critical, but the election superintendent is a big deal. It's a big deal to get a highly competent election superintendent that is above the political fray, so that your elections are fair and reasonable and above board at all times. And that's a big deal. And I think for all of us, I think we all feel the seriousness of an election and that we want to do it right, and that we want to make sure that everyone is franchised, and that the election is held in a very competent manner, and that we adjudicate it in a professional and efficient manner. And at the same time, that we also understand our cost and maintain those costs. We have that responsibility to our fellow residents.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am, Sarah.
So I guess just to set some level of expectations on my end for tomorrow, because I know that that's really where the meat and potatoes are coming in. This is just the initial discussion. I am going to have to, on my end, see an incredibly compelling argument on our side that we could administer an election fairly, accessibly, and in a way that would exceed the expectations compared to what Fulton County is currently doing. But I'm also going to want to see that estimated cost per voter, because that's really the apples to apples comparison we're looking at right now, because that's what's changed, right? The biggest thing that's changed in this is they tripled that number. We're not sure why, but I do know at the end of the day, our justification to the taxpayers and to voters simultaneously is that we could beat that number, but also exceed that level of service simultaneously. So tomorrow, I'm not sure if we'll be able to have that kind of information though, and I'll leave that up to you. And I'm sure it's going to be based largely off of the methods that we use for voting machines, number of precincts, things like that. That's probably going to be the determining factor on that estimated cost per voter. So that's my big hang up on my end. And I will say too, the other looming hesitation on my end is August, which is the first date that was provided, the significant date. That's when we start receiving the request for absentee ballots, not even us trying to figure out what we're gonna do with those absentee ballots. We receive the request for absentee ballots as early as August. We already oversee our own qualifying. That's that's soon. That's 7 months from now. My concern is we're not looking at a 2025 scenario, we're looking at a now scenario. So that's a very quick turnaround for us to be trying to not only build the plane and fly it, we're literally designing the plane and flying it. So that's a cause for pause on my end.
Thank you, ma'am. Mike, did you have something?
Yeah, I'd say big pictures, I agree with the thought process, but I think in the discussion today without a doubt, I want to make sure that we're seeing a compelling reason why it's beneficial for the taxpayers of Roswell, who are the voters of Roswell. And one of the things is, though, cost, just the fact that our cost was tripled, so I'm really looking forward to seeing that. Two, an improved service, an improved experience. As we discussed, this tripled cost involves a reduction of service. So this cost revolves around fewer locations. For example, not having a early voting site on the east side is what Fulton County's proposed. So I absolutely, as I think everyone's discussed and everyone's agreed, because I know Councilmember Hill's mentioned it as well. I think everybody's touched upon it. Seeing really both the opportunity for anyone to conveniently vote, whether on the east side or the west side early. So I see that certainly as a service improvement, and then certainly just from the operational details as well, making sure there is that confidence. So I think it's definitely an important decision, but unfortunately, I think Fulton County is certainly putting us in a very tough position.
Mike, I think you just reminded me of something. I think everyone here at the table, probably with the exception of Sarah, because you weren't in office yet, how many emails did you get during the election process about absentee? People are trying to vote absentee. They were upset. They said, I got to wait a ridiculous amount of time. I heard that time after time after time. And my assumption is every one of you got the same emails a lot during the process. And the point being is, oh yeah, we better do a better job. We have that responsibility to do a better job. I think that is part of franchising voters, right, is to make sure that you do as efficient job as possible so that everyone has the opportunity to vote in an efficient manner. And that it is very clear, and so people, it's transparent and clear where your voting locations are and your early voting locations are, and you have your early voting locations, you're set up to facilitate people being able to vote in a quick and efficient manner. That's a big deal. And I think we all feel that same, not only urgency to potentially take on the election, but to do it in a highly efficient manner. Any other thoughts or comments? Mr. Knighton, sir, any other additional thoughts or comments from you, sir?
No, I thank you. Thank you, Mayor and Council, for obviously your very intuitive and insightful thoughts and comments surrounding this matter. And we certainly look forward to bringing you additional information tomorrow evening in committee.
Thank you, Randy. Mr. Davidson, anything from you, sir? No, sir. Marlee, you're the one that's, you have a lot of history with this. You have anything from your end? All right. Well, with that being said, no other thoughts or comments or questions? I thank everybody for their time. This is a workshop on the potential of municipal elections here in the city of Roswell and our sister cities. I thank everybody. This work session is adjourned. Thank you. So we got a lot to do.